Throughout its history, Akron has been served by men and women who offered themselves in service to the community. The most recent generation of leaders helped reinvent Akron for the 21st century.
Here at the offices of the Akron Community Foundation, we hold a wealth of investments for the people of Summit County. Since 1955, our permanent endowment has supported the wide range of activities which provide the citizens of Greater Akron the quality of life that we enjoy. We are also custodians of a wealth of memories of men and women who since 1969 have received the Bert Polsky Humanitarian Award. Bert Polsky's family ran one of Akron's best-known department stores. He was a man who treated others with dignity and respect. Every one of the Polsky Award recipients has shared their wealth with us, their talent, their time committed to the community improvement, and often their personal riches as well. Each was born before the Second World War. They represent the recent generation of Akron leaders who shaped the world we live in today. For the past year, we've been capturing the stories of our Polsky recipients on videotape, and we're proud to share with you this history of Akron. It isn't all of the history, and their stories do not always capture the diversity of our community. That said, this is a group of people who helped reinvent Akron in the years after 1945. And these are people who for 50 years have been witness to Akron's history, often from front row seats. These are the people who came of age during the time of America's last great challenge.
I enlisted, went in the Air Force, and went through flight training. I was transferred to a secret project out in Kansas, and it was a B-29. First bombing raid was against the Iwata steel mills.
Well, my brother was in the service first. He was older than I and went in as a pilot. I wanted to be a fighter pilot also, but my mom said, your brother was a fighter pilot and we lost him. So I ended up as a bomber pilot. We went overseas in the Central Pacific.
They said, well, you're going to do the planning for motor transport, supply routes and everything in the Normandy invasion. Gee, Colonel, I said, I don't know anything about this. He said, well, neither does anybody else. You went to Harvard, didn't you?
It was about the third night we were in the Normandy, and I had just come off guard duty that night, and I was sleeping under one of the tanks. And a little German airplane dropped an incendiary bomb, but it went down the turret of this tank. And there were 10 underneath it, 8 under the other one, and 2 in each one. And this set all of the 3-inch shells that were in this tank off and just gutted this destroyer. And it was quite a devastating experience.
I left my quartermaster class that drove the landing craft on Omaha Beach and enrolled at Yale. And about a year later, one of the guys in my class called me. And a fellow by the name of Thompson. I said, Tommy, how is everybody? He said, they're all dead.
The World War shaped the generation of men and women that would lead Akron in the last half of the 20th century. Shaped by combat, by the loss of friends and family, or by deprivations at home, these future leaders were taking their places in a workaday world filled with uncertainty in 1945.
You know, from 46 on, nobody knew what was going to happen. WW2 had brought us out of the Depression. The Depression in America was very bad right up until 1940, 41. And nobody knew whether we'd slip back into a depression or not at that time.
And I remember many times going to the store to get a quarter's worth of salt pork. And my mother used it with the greens and the beans that came out of our garden that she cooked. I remember that although we had a gas stove, they didn't have the money to put the gas on, but they never told us that.
It was a joy to have more good things to eat than we'd had during the war. I mean, when you think of it, those little books of stamps, we'd take them to the meat man, and maybe we could only get wieners that night,
Holy Moses, you couldn't even buy a house. I was in charge of personnel for a period of time in our company, and I had a lot of young men come in and say, I'm married, I need a house, will you help me? And I'd say, well, listen, you live in the basement and we're at the first floor. A lot of them did it, and that's how they got started.
I had an old 41 Mercury convertible that I'd had before the war, and that was our transportation. And we nursed that along as long as we could.
When a guy bought a old Ford and had trouble with that, I overhauled the engine once and sold it. I bought a Nash.
We didn't have a refrigerator. We had an ice box. We didn't have a stove. We had a hot plate. And we had to do the dishes in the bathtub. And it was, and there was no car. And that's how we started out married life.
We began to believe in ourselves again.
I was young, and we had a lot of fun. I was not married, and we enjoyed ourselves.
The Garden Grill downtown, that was outstanding. And O'Neill's Tea Room. What a joy to go there. And Polsky's had a wonderful one, too.
Tangier used to be on East Exchange Street, and where Tangier is now was Papa Joe's. And they had all-male waiters. They had the best turtle soup.
In Akron, there was the Bubble Bar, and that was a meeting place for all the young people. And we'd go there, and we'd try and chisel Nick Danko out of a free drink once in a while. We never succeeded.
In 1950, shoppers and traffic jammed downtown Akron. The city was proud of new laboratories at Firestone, Goodyear, and Goodrich. A new transportation center included 2 train stations and a bus terminal connected by walkways. Work was beginning on an expressway that would speed traffic between East Exchange Street and Cuyahoga Falls Avenue. In the summer of 1950, news that the communists had crossed into South Korea heightened fears of a new nuclear war. But everyday fears of illness and disease were on every mother's mind.
Kids were at risk. A lot of kids never got to teenage, and certainly did not get to adulthood. Leukemia. There are certain types of leukemia today that are completely curable. At that time, none of it was curable.
The one thing we were concerned about was illness and disease. Polio was a big, big scourge. We were very much afraid of that.
In 1953, there was a severe epidemic. That was the year that they used the basement in Grace Church. In the early 1950s, burns were taken care of better. Antibiotics had been started. And as a result, we were able to take on cases that nobody could have even thought of before.
Hope for the future was more abundant on college campuses. The University of Akron's new president, Norman Auburn, spurred the city to erect new buildings for learning and inspired the college to grow academically. Attendance boomed after the war, as a college education was placed within reach of almost every veteran who wanted one.
I was married and had 2 children and probably would have never gone to law school if it hadn't been for the GI Bill.
Well, the GI Bill made it possible for many of us to complete our education.
I would not have gone to law school if I hadn't had the GI Bill.
I found out I had enough points for the GI Bill of Rights, and I beat it right up to New Haven, and I said, I want to finish my degree.
I went to case on the GI Bill.
1950s Akron was bursting at the seams. With new jobs and more money, young families of veterans were looking outward for homes of their own and a little land.
We purchased our first home on 10th Street in Cuyahoga Falls. Fortunately, I was able to save enough money while I was in Korea to do that. And it was a nice place to live. Clean town. And as a result, there was a great influx of people right after the war and in the early 50s in Cuyahoga Falls. Jack Heslop built many homes on the west side of State Road and in several other areas in town.
We were in one of these, I think there was a song at the time, something about Cracker Box houses all in a row, and we were in a new development. Our house probably was just 2 or 3 or 4 years old, and it was in a huge area with 600 other houses that pretty much looked like it.
As families moved to the city limits and beyond, old ways of doing business were changing too.
We wanted a store within walking distance of every citizen in the city of Akron, and we had one. But things changed. The automobile came, and then people wanted to drive the store. People got refrigerators. They didn't want to go to the store every day. So we had to enlarge the stores to accommodate them. We had to put in things that the small store couldn't handle. And we closed all of 126 stores. We opened up 43 so-called supermarkets in those days, which was about 20,000 square feet. Today's average supermarket is about 60 to 70,000 square feet, and we thought in those days that 20,000 was pretty good. As a matter of fact, we'd argue about whether it was too much ground for a woman to cover in her daily shopping.
The surge of business would push Akron's population to almost 300,000 by the end of the 1950s. No city in America could brag about the concentration of one industry in one place like Akron could. The impact of rubber on the economy, on the culture, and on the city was obvious from the first moment new citizens arrived.
You could tell when you got near Akron by the smell in the air.
Smoky, dusty, smelly, looked kind of down at the heels.
The rubber smell. That was the first thing I remember in Akron.
The American economy was driven through the decade by General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. The pressure that Detroit placed on Akron began to foreshadow the tire industry's greatest weakness.
All they care about in Detroit is that the tire be round and black and cheap. And they don't care if it's round and black.
And newcomers discovered that life in Akron, business and otherwise, was influenced by Goodyear, Goodrich, Firestone, and General.
The first question after you were introduced to someone was, who do you work for? And I said there were only 5 respectable things to do. You could work for Goodyear, Firestone, Goodrich, General Tire, or you could sell carbon black.
After 1945, a new material which had been developed as part of the war effort would begin to turn Akron in another direction. This material would create a future for the city that would outlast the monolithic tire business. A business that would find its ultimate expression in popular culture 20 years later.
Just one word. Yes, sir. Are you listening? Yes, sir, you. Plastics.
Frank Steer opened his first plastics laboratory in the back of a leather goods store and grew his business from there.
There was a vinyl material which was quite versatile, and so Goodrich picked up some of that expertise. They decided to go into the vinyl business. I was an improviser. Ben Stiller was in the advertising specialty business, and so he liked the material. He decided to make and sell these quick coins, as they call them at that time. And I duplicated in vinyl plastic. I don't know, we made over 1 million.
Millions of coin purses, plastic auto parts, vinyl toys, aprons, and office products streamed out of Akron job shops. Fortunes were made. Science spurred by the space program was America's new promise. But the prosperity of the 1950s was not available to everyone. An ugly tradition of racism had been ingrained in the American way of life.
You did not try to go and sit at the counter in Scott's 5 and 10. They had a little hot dog counter there. My mother just told us, and she didn't say because it was race or what. She just said we're not supposed to sit in those seats. You didn't see black cheerleaders. You didn't see blacks in bands and in May festivals, and you didn't see the student council president or any of those persons that were black. Only they didn't call us black then, they called us colored.
I saw a colored man in one of our stores put a pound of bacon into his trousers. I walked up to him and said, "Hey, that's stealing. You can't do that." He pulled the bacon out of his trousers. He gave it to me. And he said, "Mister," he said, "if you were colored and you couldn't get a job and you're starving, you'd steal that bacon." I said, "Yes." I said, "Here's that bacon. That's yours for keeps. And furthermore, tomorrow morning you've got a job." Out in Monroe Falls, they had a park that they were going to for a social affair. And the manager of that place called me up and he said, "Fred," he said, "you can't come. You can't have this colored man come." He said, "We don't allow colored people in our park." And the store said, "If Joe can't go, none of us are going."
I coached basketball teams with Parsigan and those boys, and there was a team that had some good black players. Well, they couldn't come into the Y and play with their team. They would have to play with their team on the outside.
You know, some of the companies here had quotas. They weren't written down, but everybody knew that they had quotas. They'd only hire so many of Catholics or so many Jews, and no blacks, need not even apply.
I applied at Ohio Bell for a job, and I took the test, and I passed the test, and then they gave me the physical. And when I went back in, I did not get the job because they said, "Well, you have a tooth that needs to be repaired, and you may have a toothache." And I said, "But I don't have a toothache." But I went to a dentist and had my teeth pulled because I thought maybe that would help me. They never did hire me, but I ended up with losing my own teeth.
I think that we kind of grew up with that and accepted it.
It wasn't that they thought it was right, but it was just something that had gone on for tens and tens and tens of years. And it was just something we lived with any more than the neighbor's barking dog. That was a part of life.
Reinventing Akron, Stories of a Generation will continue in a few moments. Important local programs that show our city as it is and provide a focus on what it can become are possible only if this station, the philanthropic and business communities, and you work together. You can help create local programs with your financial support. Call the number on your screen and become a member of PBS 45 and 49 right now. We now return to Reinventing Akron, Stories of a Generation.
Akron had matured into an economic power, but much of the city life had been left behind. It would take a tragedy to move Akron's social history forward.
5 young girls locked up in the detention home, which at that time was located on Power Street. And Eula Bonham was a very dedicated worker that we had. And she walked into the room, and these girls had been cleaning with some sort of a pneumonia. And they had a pneumonia rag, and they put this over her face in order to get her keys. Well, this rag lodged in her throat. They didn't intend to kill her, but she died from this incident.
The shocking conditions in which children were housed by the county would move a group of women to cure the problem.
And as a result of that, we organized a committee to pass a levy to build a new building. And there's no question in my mind that these women passed that levy by a 60% majority.
When I graduated from college, the expectation was that you'd probably get married. We each knew what our role was, and so we didn't really question it. We just did it.
In 1948, there was not much culture in Akron. There was boxing at the Armory, and that was probably one of the most popular sports. And it wasn't until later on that the Akron Symphony and other institutions came into being.
When these wonderful organizations such as the Art Museum was founded, it had been just a little hideaway up on Fur Hill somewhere with nothing much, but they knew that they had to volunteer.
I remember very well Betty Jaycox, who was writing for the Beacon Journal at that time, writing columns, did we want Akron to just be a mill town? And there was a strong sense that we needed to have these cultural institutions here, not just up in Cleveland. I'm very proud of what we women as volunteers have been able to accomplish.
It was a group of women, even in the face of criticism from businessmen, who saved the historic home of F.A. Seiberling, Stan Hewitt.
The four major rubber companies, Firestone, Goodrich, Goodyear, and General, they each had a designated person. When those four got together, they had the authority to back or propose projects in Akron, and if those four said it's a go, you had 60% of the project underwritten.
If the rubber company said, we want this to happen at Portage Country Club, it would happen back in the late 40s and the 50s, even the 60s, no question about it, it would happen. And we had quite a voice in what went on. And we used our voices.
Jack Knight was a powerful man in this community. He could lead because it was his newspaper, and with a stroke of a pen, he could talk to 300,000 people.
If Eddie Thomas called or Jack Knight called, why, you didn't say no, you just said, sure, we'll do it.
Jack Knight was the most powerful, respected, and sometimes almost in fear or held in awe. But I have heard people say, and I think it's at Goodyear, they said they'd take a bullet for Eddie Thomas. He was loved. And when Eddie spoke, people listened out of pure respect and love.
By 1960, the men who led the city of Akron could afford to be inspired by the city's possibilities. And the city now supported an orchestra, museums, a zoo, and a new World Series of golf. But the crowded central city was still home to a factory right in the middle of downtown, where cereal was shot from guns. In the 1960s, Quaker Oats, along with International Harvester, were brand names of Akron's past. Jobs were lost, but with the removal of the factory came a new opportunity to modernize the city for the first time in a century.
They tore down the old Quaker Oats plant, which is right where Cascade is now, and the top of the parking deck was they were going to develop buildings on top of that.
The Cascade Urban Renewal Project would eliminate the factories and create a city plaza, a hotel, and new office buildings. It would take 3 mayors, Leo Berg, Ed Erickson, and John Ballard, and it would require one man's singular power to make the Cascade project a reality.
Ed DeBartolo became the tenant of the air rights, and he didn't do anything with it. So they asked me and Ed DeBartolo and I to meet with Ben Maidenberg and Jack Knight at the Mayflower. And Mr. Knight told me, he said, now, Ed, I want you to cancel that lease. He said, you're not doing anything with it. Let somebody else. And Ed said, well, I spent $50,000, $75,000. What about that? And Mr. Knight looked at him, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. He said, Ed, if you don't cancel that lease, my newspapers are going to destroy you. And Ed looked at me, he says, he doesn't give you a lot of room to negotiate, does he? Cancel it. And so they put it out for bids again, and nobody bid on it. And so Jack Knight called John Galbraith and said, don't embarrass my city, put a bid in. And Galbraith said, okay. And he did put a bid in, and then he and Jack Knight got all the community leaders, the industrial leaders and business leaders, and said, look, you've got to take a floor or 2 on this building.
And I said, why should we do that? Well, you never saw anything like this. It went back and forth between Jack and I. There was a small group, I think we were down in one of the rooms at the Mayflower Hotel. Well, he was a friend, but he got mad. And he stormed out of the room. But we did lease a floor, even though we didn't need it and we never used it.
While Knight was fighting for Cascade, His friend and lawyer Blake McDowell was arguing for a new library. In 1960, the library wanted to move from its cramped quarters at East Market and High Streets, but some felt that downtown was an unhealthy place for the new main library.
Well, it was important for the library, and I think for the downtown, to have a good library easily available. And it was a major step for Russ Munn, the librarian. He felt that a library was such an important part of the culture that he wanted to make it readily accessible.
60 years of growth spurts in the rubber industry had made Akron a hodgepodge of factories, narrow streets, and housing that had fallen into decay. Over an 11-year period, from 1962 through 1973, the face of Akron would change forever through federal programs of urban renewal.
The various grants which we helped get for industry and redevelopment in Akron brought over $1 billion of investment to Akron.
And the reason urban renewal was so necessary were that these lots, like on Main Street, those lots would have 20 feet frontage, 25 feet. They were very small and maybe only go back 75 or 100 feet. And they might be in families that have owned that thing for years and years and years. Some of those went back to when that was a canal on Main Street. And so there you stood with 100 parcels, which you had to get rid of all at one time to make a parcel large enough that somebody could use. And so urban renewal and condemnation was the only way to do it.
The first area to be developed was 100 acres along Grant Street and Wolf Ledges, what Akron used to know as Goosetown. 45 acres at the center of town became Cascade Plaza, with a 2,000-car parking garage and a 300-room hotel. Houses which had been erected hastily 50 years before were eliminated on 25 acres near the University of Akron and replaced with the Lee Jackson Athletic Complex. And along the canal, the open ditch became a park, Opportunity Park. And one of Akron's oldest neighborhoods gave way to a new headquarters site for the B.F. Goodrich Company. Urban renewal also came with a different price for some residents.
A lot of families were displaced. With their family in the neighborhood, they were moved away from it. Remember, Akron was segregated, and as blacks, you could not live in Firestone Park, and you could not live in Ellet. And there were just many areas that we could not go and live in, even if you had the money.
I would call on maybe 3, 4, 5 families a week, and I would write a report as to how they were doing. These families, for the most part, had problems beyond belief. I had a couple of families, I remember, because at the time the welfare allotment was so low, and they couldn't buy soap.
African American families suffered disproportionately under urban renewal. The 1950s had sparked a new movement of black citizens led by Dr. Martin Luther King. In Akron, no leader of the black community was more prominent than Vernon Odom, executive director of the Community Service Center and Urban League.
I think Vernon Odom was just a giant in this community. And he was regarded by not only the black community, but the white community, that he really spoke with a voice, and he really had passion, and he really tried to do things.
Vern would tell you when you were wrong. I mean, he was a strong individual.
Then on July 17, 1968, the frustration of Akron's African American community boiled over. The city experienced the worst violence in its history. Over 6 days, 40 people were injured in scuffling between police and the young black men who took to the streets. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage was done, mostly to white-owned stores. 400 were arrested, and the larger community was embroiled in a confrontation it was ill-equipped to manage.
We had the riots, the race riots. I even carried a pistol. I hate guns, and I even carried one to work for a couple days. And most people were very worried. They didn't know how far this was going to spread.
There was a little feeling of insecurity in a sort of, bedroom subdivision kind of community out in the woods in northern Hudson Township. a lot of concern that somehow or other all of this agitation would boil out of inner city Akron and affect the suburbs.
As Akron looked for leadership in this new crisis, it was not Jack Knight who would find a way out, but rather the publisher of his newspaper, Ben Maidenberg.
John Ballard was going to call in the National Guard. He had no choice, and Ben said, no, wait a minute, just give me a chance. And he and Bill Perry, now Bill Perry was the head of the Council of Churches. Ben Maidenberg and Bill Perry walked Worcester Avenue one night when any white man was crazy to be within a mile of that place. They could have been killed. They walked that street that night and calmed that neighborhood and that street with their integrity. And that is Ben Maidenberg, a giant, an absolute giant.
The 1960s, with multiple assassinations of public figures and a war abroad unpopular with many Americans, was a decade filled with social and political turmoil.
So when the Vietnam War started to really heat up, and a lot of young people were getting disaffected, I thought, well, we really must do something to correct this. The day that the United States invaded Cambodia, and as we drove down Exchange Street, I saw this big student rally at Jackson Field at the University of Akron. And I made a speech saying, this is a democracy. You don't have to take these streets. You can go down and vote. And someone took a picture of me with my hands in the air and a couple of long-haired students on each side. And Congressman Ayers got a hold of that and started sending it all around saying, here's my opponent stirring up student unrest at the University of Akron. To everybody's surprise, of course, I won. The 1970s were a tough time for Akron.
Reinventing Akron, Stories of a Generation will continue in a few moments. Important local programs that show our city as it is and provide a focus on what it can become are possible only if this station, the philanthropic and business communities, and you work together. You can help create local programs with your financial support. Call the number on your screen and become a member of PBS 45 and 49 right now. We now return to Reinventing Akron, Stories of a Generation.
We hadn't made money in tires in Akron in years, and this was the headquarters of the United Rubber Workers. So they were under the gun here always that they had to be the leaders in the gains they get for their people.
We had a legacy of indecisiveness with regard to our huge Akron complex. All of it obsolete as far as even 1960s, 70s level manufacturing technology was concerned. We had just neglected, probably more than any of our competitors, to face up to those issues.
Goodrich became the first Akron tire maker to experiment with a new tire design developed by Michelin in Europe, the radial tire.
I had lived through and been part of the radial revolution in the 70s.
I was a victim of it. Goodyear, to get into radial tires, was really a challenging event. Radial tires, although it helped you if you had experience in crossfly tires, it was an entirely different challenge.
Pilliod had been in Europe for Goodyear and was convinced that radial tires would eventually run the bias-ply tire into extinction. It was not an easy sale to make back home.
The original equipment people in the States didn't want to pay the price for it at that time. The cost of producing a radial tire over a bias was about 35%. When I became president of the domestic company, I tried to convince them immediately that we should go to radials.
He's the guy that dragged us kicking and screaming into the radial age.
I went in to see Rusty Young, as I was president, not CEO at that time, and I gave him the whole story. And he said, "What do you think it'll cost us?" And I said, "Well, rough guess, very rough. I'd say $1.5 billion to $2 billion to do it all, because we'll have to develop the machinery and equipment and build a plant. We can't put it in one of the existing plants. We'd have to start all new." And he sat there a little bit, and he says, "You're convinced?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Okay, let's do it."
Despite Detroit's reluctance, Goodyear and Piliad forged ahead. By the end of the 1970s, Detroit would be all radial. But for Akron, it was not to be good news.
To put that in a unionized plant in Akron, Ohio, would have been impossible, so we didn't even tackle that. We had to change the whole psychology, the whole thinking. And that was the whole step we made. That plant out in Lawton, Oklahoma now is the largest tire plant in the United States. It's still non-union.
We want to get into a new radial truck tire facility. We talked about it, and we tried to find the land in Akron. You couldn't find it.
By 1976, when the Rubber Workers Union struck all 4 companies, discussions were focused on union rules that limited productivity, the 6-hour day, and a dozen different classifications of union jobs.
The fact that people said the labor rates are too high, the labor unions are causing too much trouble, and Akron's going to die because of them. And I said, that's not true. That's not true.
Piliad needed one concession in Akron, but did not get it.
After we got the plant out in Lawton working, and it became time we needed to build radial tires in other places, we went to the union in Akron and offered them a opportunity of working with a radial plant, a new one we'd put in here. But they would have to agree to the work rule changes, which start with that just 2 classifications. Pete says, "Well, that'll be a topic of discussion in the April annual meeting of the negotiations."
And so what happened?
I shut it down.
Yes, it was painful for me. I mean, obviously, in human terms, you're putting hundreds and hundreds of people out of work. We didn't put thousands at one time, but 300 here, and a year or two later, 400 there, and so on. That's not easy to do, and you get a lot of criticism for it, and it's not a pleasant thing to do. On the other hand, it's like the necessity sometimes to reshape the institution in order to have the institution survive at all. I was trying to save the company, and in saving the company, some parts of it had to be sacrificed.
Then, on June 23, 1977, an employee of one of the city's smaller rubber companies emptied a powerful chemical into Akron's sewer system.
I represent Patch Rubber when they were out on strike when the kid there on the picket line emptied one of our tanks and blew up the cemetery, did $10 million worth of damage to our storm sewers. By noon that day, we had 3 southern governors call and say, "You come to our state, you'll never have that kind of a problem."
We felt that the tire industry had become a global business. We felt as a result of that, the obvious conclusion would be a substantial contraction of the industry. There would be a consolidation of companies. So we thought one day there will only be 4 or 5 tire companies in the world. And we didn't see Goodrich as being a survivor in that scenario.
In early 1978, Goodyear closed Plant 2. Firestone closed a factory in March. By Thanksgiving, Mohawk Tire would lock its doors. By the end of the 1970s, Akron would lose 30,000 jobs and 60,000 residents. The 1980s would bring further consolidation.
And when opportunity knocked in 1985, was that good luck? Damn right, but we were ready to move. I mean, we knew exactly what we wanted to do. Here was Uniroyal about to be dismembered. We went to them and said, look, we've got a great replacement market. You have a great original equipment tire business. So that happened, that worked out very well because not all, but most of the people who were working in our tire business maintained their jobs, first with Uniroyal Goodrich Tire Company, as it was called, and latterly with Michelin.
We sold the tire operations in the latter part of 1987, I think it was, and Continental Gummy Work in Germany bought it.
Goodrich and General had fended off corporate raiders. In October 1986, Goodyear chairman Robert Mercer was on his way home from Japan. He stepped off a commercial flight in Chicago to accept an urgent phone call.
My chief financial officer said, there's a strange move in Goodyear stock, and we think we're being raided. I went to New York to see Goldman Sachs, who was our financial crowd, and I said, I need to know a couple of things. You know, what is this guy all about? How fearful should we be? He's serious, and he's ruthless. He sees you as an opportunity to make some big cash in a hurry.
Sir James Goldsmith, billionaire corporate raider, maintained an apartment in New York City. Prior to Goldsmith's targeting of Goodyear, the stock had soared from $33 a share. Against all advice, Mercer paid Goldsmith a visit.
And I said, Jimmy, you've told me what you did for guys who used to be my shareholder. Now tell me what you did for my shareholder who bought this stock at 72. And he didn't have an answer for that.
Mercer explained to Goldsmith that Goodyear's chemical business was part of the company's vertical integration.
He made the point repeatedly that we were over-diversified, and he was going to put an end to that. And, of course, my comment to his story on that was, hey, here's a guy who's got a wife and 2 mistresses, and he's accusing us of over-diversification. You know, I just had a little trouble with the morality of that whole picture.
Mercer was determined to maintain the Akron company's independence. He had the city and the state behind him. Congressman John Seiberling, whose grandfather had once lost the company he founded, had a personal stake.
I asked him, I said, you know, you have said publicly that Goodyear is the best managed company in the industry, and that you know nothing about the rubber industry yourself. So my question is, who the hell are you?
We sold off 19% of the business to keep our independence. If we had lost, he would have sold off 40%. Goodyear would never be the same.
Akron would never be the same. No longer could 4 men seated in the lounge of the Portage Country Club make decisions for the community. Mayor Roy Ray forged new partnerships with business. One result was a $100 million investment by the city, by the federal government, and by Goodyear in a new technical center in the old Plant 2. A new model of leadership for the community was being born.
A number of us decided that maybe the Area Progress Board and Chamber should be merged, and we succeeded in doing that.
Times were tougher for all of us. I mean, we were going through changes. We were being raided by Goldsmith or Ben Heineman or whatever. Our businesses were less profitable. Our margins were under pressure. The economy was diversifying. And so we had to broaden the base of support, get the whole community and the whole business community, for that matter, involved, not just a handful of companies.
There was a significant group of the business community that recognized that there needed to be a clearinghouse of priorities for the community. Not everybody that wanted something done or needed to have something done could come up with the resources to accomplish it. That was solved by putting together what they call the Akron Priority Corp at the time, similar today to the Akron Tomorrow Group that is newer, but it marshaled assets, it marshaled thinking, and then made decisions as to which priority should come first and for what size their needs should be met.
Between 1980 and 1990, a series of projects were placed before the priority group for support. Bankers were part of the new leadership structure and began to see their role differently. Lending risks would be balanced against saving the central city. A housing project along the canal failed, but the YMCA, a temple to Art Deco design, was saved.
It was a cornerstone for the city of Akron. So I think if we would look around today and say, is there an example of a situation that could have went from bad to worse, that would have been let the Y fail and the building be knocked down for renovation and renewal. It was the right thing to do at the right time.
Through the decades of the 70s and 80s, Akron's Convention Bureau operated out of space almost concealed from public view at Cascade Plaza. In 1987, with nearly $6 million in the bank, the time had come to invest it.
Don Pasqualik and the Summit County delegation went down to see Governor Celeste. And they said, we want money for a convention center. And I'll never forget it. Celeste went right around the room. He said, do you want your pet projects? You always come up with pet projects, or do you want that convention center? And every one of them said, we want the convention center. And it didn't have anything to do with Democrats, Republicans, or anything. They were united. And for that, Pasqualik, he did it.
The new convention center was named for John S. Knight, Akron's greatest business leader of the post-war era.
This center is the first one built in the United States with no debt. And we had $2 million in our hip pocket.
When the convention center opened in 1994, it would be the first of two new downtown structures designed by Akron native James Stewart Polshek. In October 1987, Mayor Pasqualik told the National Inventors Hall of Fame in Washington that Akron was ready to become its permanent home, and that Dr. Bruce Rothman would raise the money needed to do it.
You know, to go out and ask somebody to give money to a building that you didn't know where it was going to be or what it looked like, but it was a concept. And here, once again, that's Akron. Akron will do something like that if it sounds like it's worthwhile. We had support from the state early on, and then every foundation came through, and then business came through very, very well. So that we were able to raise $10 million early on, which was going to guarantee at least the start of the National Inventors Hall of Fame.
There was progress of another sort in the 1980s when Mayor Tom Sawyer approached Dorothy Jackson about joining his cabinet.
When I would ride in parades, little senior citizens would be so proud and so happy. It was, for them, it was something that they thought they would never see in their lifetime, a black woman in the mayor's cabinet.
By the end of the 1980s, Akron's economy had begun to recover from the loss of rubber jobs. New manufacturing and design industries had sprouted up. Technical centers of Goodyear, Bridgestone, Firestone, Goodrich, and General assured Akron's place as the Polymer Research Center of the United States and one of 3 research capitals in the world. And the community had matured in other ways as well, with robust cultural institutions like Blossom Music Center and the new Cuyahoga Valley National Park.
Had built a house right on the edge of the Cuyahoga Valley in 1960. And it seemed to me that unless we took some action, that beautiful valley was going to be cluttered up with industry and development. Somebody had to take the lead, and I decided I would do so. And I managed in my second year in Congress to get made a member of the House Committee on Interior Affairs, which handled national park issues. I was told that the chairman of the subcommittee, Roy Taylor of North Carolina, on the way up in the plane told his staff person, now, of course, this Cuyahoga Valley isn't going to be a national park caliber, but John's a good member of the subcommittee, and we want to help him. We did have a hearing at the Blossom Music Center. And they said that the same staffer told me that all the way back on the plane, Roy Taylor was saying, now that's a wonderful place and we have to save it.
After 1990, Main Street would begin to look like a modern city center, A new baseball stadium, Canal Park, would be home to a Double-A baseball team, the Arrows. The leadership of the Greater Akron community would be further diversified with the creation of the Leadership Akron program.
When I was a young guy coming up in management, there were people in senior management who spent a lot of time thinking about the community and needs and actively promoting inside the company people like me to get involved. I mean, I was encouraged to get involved. I was naturally inclined to do it, but I certainly was also pushed. And I think as times got tougher, competition became more rigorous, there was less time within the firm, so to speak, to promote that kind of behavior.
We were running out of qualified decision makers. And the best way we could start qualifying people for the long haul was to get them into the Akron Leadership Program.
We needed a diversity of leaderships, young people who were coming up in the community, and we needed them to learn the community.
By the end of the decade, more than 400 men and women from all ethnic backgrounds, from all parts of the larger community, had graduated from Leadership Akron, taking their places alongside Akron's leaders of the past. Greater Akron reinvented itself once again.
Having gone through the loss of a major industry and have to rebuild, there are very few towns in the country that have faced that, as we have faced with the rubber industry leaving Akron in the past 20 years. We've learned that you can survive it. You must do some unique things to change it. You have to be committed to it, and you have to let the process take place regardless of who gets the credit.
Well, I saw the city develop, and I saw it lose its major part of its major industry and just come roaring back with so many other industries, some of them small, some of them not so small. But it changed the character and nature of the community, and demonstrated, I think, the community's ability to accommodate a new world.
For the last half of the 20th century, the community of Akron was served by men and women who were honored with the Bert Polsky Humanitarian Award. They were a generation of leaders shaped by a war. In turn, they shaped a community and a new generation of leaders to come.